Good afternoon, everybody. I am David Levy, the Dean of Duke Law School. Welcome to the Brainerd Currie Memorial Lecture. This lecture is named in honor of Professor Brainerd Currie, who taught contracts, admiralty, and conflict of laws at Duke from 1946 to 1949, and then again from 1961 to 1965. He was an admired scholar and a beloved teacher here at Duke, as well as at several other law schools. He was the leading theorist of his time on the conflict of laws. This lecture series began in 1967, and since that time, it has been given by scholars of the very first rank, truly extraordinary thinkers in the law. This year's lecturer is Jack Landman Goldsmith, the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He is the author of Power and Constraint, The Accountable Presidency After 9/11, and The Terror Presidency, Law and Judgment Inside the Bush Administration, as well as many other books, articles on topics related to terrorism, national security, international law, conflicts of law, and internet law. Professor Goldsmith served as Assistant Attorney General, Office of Legal Counsel from October 2003 through July 2004. I see Walter Dellinger here, who also served in that capacity, and Special Counsel to the General Counsel to the Department of Defense from September 2002 through June 2003. He clerked for Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court, for Judge Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and for Judge George Aldrich on the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal. He is the co-author of the Lawfare blog. He's a good friend to many of us, a delightful person, and a very creative and powerful scholar. Professor Goldsmith.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you. Sorry. Hi, thank you for that nice introduction, David, and excuse me one second. Thanks so much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's great to be here. I have many friends on the faculty, and I love being in North Carolina. Let's see how this works. Okay, Brainerd Currie. So as David said, this lecture series is named after Brainerd Currie, and when David asked me to give this lecture, one of the reasons I was inclined to do so is because I am actually among the probably very few people in the academy who is a great admirer of Brainerd Currie. Most of the students in the room probably don't know who he was. He was, as David said, among many other things, he was most noted for his very influential writings on the conflict of laws. And I think it's fair to say that he had a greater impact on the conflict of laws in the second half of the 20th century than anyone. Most people think not a positive impact. I was, early in my career in law school, obsessed with conflict of laws, and I was obsessed with Brainerd Currie. I didn't agree with most of what he said, but he had a large impact on my thinking. He was a brilliant man. I also got to know his son, David, very well, who was also a brilliant lawyer at the University of Chicago. So I'm very pleased to give the Brainerd Currie lecture. I'm going to be talking about internet freedom, and I'm basically in this lecture, I want to try to bring together some familiar things you read in the newspaper and put them in a larger and hopefully somewhat coherent perspective. And the target of my talk is the U.S. Internet Freedom Vision, which I will date from between 1996 and 2016. So the second term of the Clinton administration through the end of the Obama administration. And during this period, the United States government had a very consistent and coherent, it was a developing view of internet freedom, but they had a consistent and coherent theory that they pushed in legislation and regulation and international affairs. And it was one that insisted on the free flow of information across borders. The United States was against blocking internet services with very few exceptions. They didn't like content blocking or any form of blocking. Intellectual property was the one major exception to this for the United States. They were against burdensome internet regulations, internet technology regulations. This was especially started in the Clinton administration. It was a libertarian approach, a market-based, anti-government, libertarian approach to the development of the internet, non-tax. The idea was, as the internet became commercialized and in the 1990s, and especially since the United States was a leader both in developing the internet and had the leading internet firms at the time and growing and continuing so. This was an approach designed to enhance the spread of the internet and the growth of the use of the internet and the growth of speech on the internet. During the Clinton administration, the last half of the second term, there wasn't much focus on censorship. And the reason was because in the 1990s, for those of you who remember, it was thought that the internet couldn't be censored. So they didn't, Clinton, when he went to China in '98, I think he famously said that trying to regulate the internet is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. He meant to say that it couldn't be done. And there was a belief in the 1990s that the internet was a service and a technology that simply couldn't be regulated because it was everywhere and nowhere at once, and content could be stored abroad and sent over borders, and it was hard to stop the flow of content over borders. By the time of George W. Bush's presidency, and especially in Barack Obama's presidency, this became a concern because nations, authoritarian nations especially, but not just authoritarian nations, became adept at regulating the internet in a variety of ways that I'm going to talk about. So that was the basic internet freedom policy. The United States argued that this was the right way to promote the internet, that this would promote free speech globally, that it would produce wealth, that it would give individuals access to all of the miracles of the internet, and this was just a win-win for everyone. That was the basic theory. The theory became more developed, the position became more developed during the Obama administration, and especially the most important landmark in the U.S. Internet Freedom Initiative vision was a 2010 speech by Secretary of State Clinton, in which she gave this view of American foreign policy and really American internet policy its most full-throated, explicit defense. And she added these three points to the basic U.S. position. One is that the United States was going to be proactive in promoting internet freedom abroad. This was something that actually began under the Bush administration, but what this meant concretely was that the United States would spend money to help spread freedom in authoritarian states, to help people in authoritarian states circumvent, to maintain anonymity, to circumvent filtering and censorship, that the United States would give them tools and give them training, and basically would help promote internet freedom in an aggressive, subsidized way, including with technical assistance. She also pointed out that cybersecurity was important to internet freedom because if these networks weren't secure, then all of the wealth especially and everything embedded in the internet would depend upon security, so she emphasized that. And she also emphasized that the United States wanted to establish international norms reflecting this position. So that, in a nutshell, is the vision. And I'm here to say that it's failed. And I'm going to tell you why it's failed. I'm going to say why it's failed and then what will be done about it. I don't know what should be done about it. And I'm not sure anything can be done about it. I'm pretty pessimistic. But I want to spend most of my talk talking about why it's failed. And there are basically three reasons. The United States is widely seen as really one of the enemies of internet freedom, and I'm going to explain that, despite the vision I just articulated. It turns out that the United States has failed and cannot promote internet freedom abroad, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And as we're experiencing every day, internet freedom at home is creating big problems. Okay, so first, the United States is seen as cyberbully. I mean 5 things by this. I'm going to tell you basically 5 stories. So the Frightful Five is the name I think the New York Times gave to to Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, these global internet technology conglomerates that really dominate internet and services and related services around the globe. And it is hard to exaggerate what a threat, how big a threat other nations see the so-called Frightful Five. They're viewed to have outsized influences on economies. They're viewed to shape values in other places in ways that aren't consonant with local values. They're seen as sucking out data from those countries, sending them back to the United States, and supporting ever more powerful algorithms to enhance the power and products of these companies. They're viewed as, and they're viewed basically with wide resentment. Now, I mean this mostly by governments. Consumers like these products. It's governments that don't like the Frightful Five. This is best captured in a quotation from Matthias Dopfner, who's the head of the largest digital publishing unit in Europe, and also the president of the Federation of German Newspapers. He wrote an open letter, a long open letter, to Eric Schmidt of Google in 2014, in which he said a lot of things, but this really captures the European sensibility on this. We are afraid of Google. It concerns our values, our understanding of the nature of humanity, our worldwide social order, and from our perspective, the future of Europe. Those are large claims, and there's a lot of self-interest underlying his complaints about Google, but I think that accurately reflects the way that a lot of people see the Frightful Five. So the United States is viewed as basically, its firms are viewed as dominant in this area, and a lot of countries don't like it. Second, in the Arab Spring and before the Arab Spring and lots of disruptions from 2009 to 2011, U.S. internet firms, and especially social media, were perceived to be very important in facilitating the uprisings, especially in the Arab Spring, but in other countries as well. And there's an academic debate about the extent to which social media actually did help foster those revolutions, and that's contested. But what's not contested is that these social media firms and encrypted communication firms, platforms, were almost all American firms, and they were seen as tools of American power, and they were seen as express tools of American power, as tools of the American government. 4 days after the first protests in 2009, the so-called Twitter protests in Iran, the New York Times, I think it was 4 days after, ran a story on the front page saying that the State Department was working very closely with Twitter to make sure that Twitter stayed up and running during they were due for a scheduled service that would have taken the service down, and that Twitter was up and running and was available as a tool to help foster this revolution. And this was confirmed a lot of countries, authoritarian countries' views that these technologies were actually going hand to hand with U.S. foreign policy and were threats to their sovereignty and to the existence of these governments. And there was lots of other evidence of, especially the relationship between the Obama administration and Silicon Valley, and that they were working hand in hand. And of course, 6 or 8 months later, Hillary Clinton gives the Internet Freedom Speech in which she says, yeah, we're behind this, we're supporting it, we're paying for it. And that was widely applauded at home, but abroad in authoritarian states, that was viewed with horror. Evgeny Morozov, in his excellent book, The Net Delusion, describes it as that the web was perceived as some kind of made-in-America digital missile that could undermine authoritarian stability. That's a little bit flowery, but that captures the idea that around 2009, 2010, 2011, the combination of these protests, which seemed to be organized and inspired with social media tools, combined with Hillary Clinton's speech, combined with these overt connections and overt coordination between the United States and trying to use these tools to really bring down governments abroad. And the authoritarian states took notice. Third, again, I want to emphasize that for almost all of this talk, I'm being descriptive. I'm trying to explain why certain things have happened. Third, Cyber Command was stood up also in 2009. This was an effort to establish a more organized offensive cyber capability. And the idea was that we would establish an organization very closely related to the National Security Agency that would engage in offensive operations. And this was widely viewed abroad as the United States militarizing cyberspace. And it was viewed that way at home, but it was also viewed that way abroad especially. And this view became more accepted when Stuxnet was reported by the New York Times in 2010. This was the name given to the operation allegedly by the United States and Israel to use cyber means to interrupt Iran's nuclear centrifuges. So this was the use of cyber offensive operations, really across air gaps. It was an extraordinary operation to basically have an effect in Iran to adversely impact their nuclear weapons development. And this gave, for the people who were already worried about what they were reading in the newspapers about the United States and its capacities, this gave a lot of people pause. Former CIA director and National Security Agency director Michael Hayden described it as follows: that Stuxnet Olympic Games was the name of the U.S. operation. Stuxnet was what the worm was described as. Stuxnet Olympic Games, was the first attack, this is a quote, of a major nature in which a cyber attack was used to effect physical destruction. Rather than simply steal data or disrupt a normal computer's operation, excuse me, I didn't read that well. Let me try that again. It was the first attack of a major nature in which a cyber attack was used to effect physical destruction, as opposed to simply stealing data or disrupting a normal computer's operation. Somebody's crossed the Rubicon, Hayden said, comparing the attack on Iran to August 1945, when the world first witnessed the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Olympic Games coming on top of Cyber Command, coming on top of the use of social media being identified with the U.S. government. This is all creating a picture abroad of the United States as the aggressive user of cyber operations to monkey in other people's sovereignty, to do what was viewed as harm in other people's networks in their countries. And last but certainly not least was the Snowden revelations in 2013. And these revelations basically revealed that the National Security Agency was indeed living in the networks of just about every other country. They had broken into and were withdrawing data for a variety of reasons through a variety of programs in other nations. And they were also, this is when the domestic programs, especially 702, became known to the public, and in which it became clear to the public that the United States firms' possession of data inside the United States, the fact that Gmail was frequently used and Facebook was frequently used, and that traffic transited through the United States, that this gave the United States a huge asymmetrical advantage in collecting information that was of data and communications and metadata that was basically concerning conversations and activities outside the United States. It would be hard to overstate the extent to which the Snowden revelations, on top of all of these things, made the world think that the United States was really the greatest danger to internet freedom. We were doing, it seemed to many, and not just in authoritarian states, in Europe as well, and other countries, that we were doing the very things that Hillary Clinton was saying one shouldn't do in her speech in 2010. It meant that the combination of these things meant that whatever moral authority the United States had in its internet freedom program had dissipated. It showed that the United States, as I just said, was heavily involved in surreptitious activities in other networks. It seemed to give the lie to Secretary Clinton's complaints in her 2010 speech that quotes that nations that, quote, systematically violate the rights and privacy of those who use the internet for peaceful political purposes should be ostracized and punished. They showed that the NSA was undermining the very encryption tools that the State Department was pushing to preserve anonymity abroad. And they basically, all of these things together, gave other nations of the world, authoritarian states and not, the incentive, the cover, the excuse, and something of a roadmap to do all of these things itself. It really sparked, these things together sparked an arms race in both surveillance at home and in protecting domestic networks from foreign infiltration and in using information operations and cyber operations abroad. So the first point I want to make is the United States activities from basically 2009 to 2013, those revelations really cut the knees out of the Internet Freedom Program. Second, the United States has failed in its efforts to impose internet freedom abroad. This is, I think, a somewhat familiar story. I'm not going to go through all of these, but Tim Wu and I wrote a book in 2006 called Who Controls the Internet? Illusions of a Borderless World. And the thesis of the book, this was basically a response to the 1990s vision that the internet couldn't be regulated by states, by nations. And the basic thesis of the book was that nations within territories can use coercive means to achieve extraordinary control over the content that's available on the internet within their borders and on the use of digital technologies within their borders. And that part of the thesis, I think, has been, we weren't the only ones to think that, it's been proven largely true. And nations, especially in response to the events I just described, have become more and more adept of using a variety of strategies, from filters at the borders to all sorts of laws about filters in the borders, to surveillance, to using social media to surveil the users of technology, to using backdoors to break encryption, to insisting that companies that do business allow access to otherwise encrypted, that create a means to allow access to otherwise encrypted communications, to growing homegrown services. Basically, states that are adept, states that are technologically sophisticated, and China is the main example, the leading example, have achieved extraordinary control over their networks. Not every nation is as good as China, but the idea that regulating the internet was like nailing Jell-O to the wall has been proven false. China has brought extraordinary control. At the same time, it doesn't mean that they clamp down on all speech. They're very sophisticated and subtle about it. At the same time that China has an extraordinarily robust, it has to be said, internet within its borders. But certain forms of speech and certain forms of organization are not allowed, and they have lots of tools to ensure that they can control that. Now, this is a Freedom House study that was just published a couple of months ago through 2018, and basically everything but green is bad news from Freedom House's perspective. This is basically Freedom House has been studying internet freedom since Hillary Clinton's speech in 2010. Every year they studied it, they use qualitative measures. What they're measuring is traditional freedom of speech and expression on networks and around the world. And basically using qualitative criteria, they show that their numbers show that every year since Hillary Clinton's speech, internet freedom has declined in general. Some nations get better some years, but on the whole, every year it gets worse. And the point is that these tools are being used increasingly successfully around the world. The Arab Spring, as I said earlier, was thought to be a counterexample, but the conventional wisdom now, I think it's fair to say, is that the problem in 2009, 2010, 2011 was not that states were incapable of controlling these tools while also allowing their people to use them, but rather that they were either not adequately prepared or didn't have the sophistication. And basically what's happened since 2009, 2010, 2011 is that authoritarian states have become much more adept at reverse engineering these tools and, in fact, using social media tools as tools of surveillance and tools of control. Ron Deibert, after studying this, said, he's a prominent internet analyst from Canada, authoritarian regimes, I think this is an accurate statement, have proven themselves surprisingly and dismayingly light-footed and adaptable at controlling internet and social media and in using these tools for authoritarian ends. So that is the situation in authoritarian states. The European Union is a different story. This is another story of nations of a different territorial sovereignty, also imposing its vision of the internet in its territory in a way that departs from U.S. internet freedom. Basically, the EU has a different conception of the United States, as I'm sure you're aware, about the nature of privacy, the nature of consumer control over data, the relationship between firms and data, and between the individual and firms. They value privacy and consumer control much more than the United States. They have a quite different conception of free speech, and they're much more inclined to regulate than the United States is in general. And so, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and frankly, this has been going on since the dawn of the global internet. And Tim and I talked about this in our book, but it's grown much more consequential in the last 5 or 6 years. Europe has regulated antitrust and hate speech and privacy. The right to be forgotten is a prominent example. They've successfully imposed ever-increasing taxes on U.S. firms. they can do what they want, the European Union can, to these firms and their borders. And as the basic principle in both the authoritarian states and in places even like Europe is that the more burdensome regulation wins. The brute fact is that US firms that do business abroad have to comply with local laws. And the permissive environment in the United States, whether it's a speech environment or whether it's a business environment, doesn't hold abroad. And if the market is big enough, as China and the European Union are, US firms have to bow to those regulations. And the United States has not succeeded yet, either in the authoritarian states or in the European Union, in imposing its particular vision. So what we see happening is basically what I've sketched a little bit, I'm going to fill it out a little bit more now, is a digital Cold War between basically these three blocks: the authoritarian states, the European Union, and the United States. And I'm sorry to keep talking about my book with Tim. I'm going to tell you one more thing about it, and then I'm going to tell you what we got wrong. In the penultimate paragraph of the book, after describing the various ways that nations we thought would be successful at controlling internet flows and content and usage within their borders, and in talking about the ways in which some of these domestic controls are starting to seep out and have externalities in other countries, we said the following: it's not just that nations have the power to shape the internet's architecture in different ways. It's that the United States, China, and Europe are using their coercive powers to establish different visions of what the internet might be. In so doing, they will attract other nations to choose among models of control, ranging from the United States' relatively free and open model to China's model of political control, with the European Union in the middle. The result, this is 2006, is the beginning of a technological version of the Cold War, with each side pushing its own vision of the internet's future. This is exactly what we see going on with China. Is not just using these tools within its borders, it is coordinating with other authoritarian states, with technical assistance, with learning, and helping authoritarian states achieve some sort of control. It's not just China that's doing that, but they're the leader. The European Union is in a variety of ways exporting its vision to the United States. The big question here is whether the right to be forgotten, which is basically a right to have information about you delisted from not made available on search engines, whether that will have extraterritorial effect. That's before the European Court right now, that question. And if that question comes out is answered the way some people think, it means that European conceptions of privacy will be imposed globally, and there won't be anything Google can do about that. The Googles of the world can do about that. And so the other blocks are exporting their vision in just the same way we were trying to export our vision on the Clinton model and the Clinton model, Obama model. And so there's this large fight going on. And what I've tried to suggest so far is that on the global level, the United States we still have dominant IT firms. I don't think that any of these regulations in Europe are going to kill these firms. They might affect their the bottom line profits. It's not clear how Europe might use antitrust law to affect these firms. On the whole, I don't think that those firms are going to certainly stop doing business in Europe or anything like that. The situation in the Chinas of the world is more precarious, because China, as a condition of doing business, really places very high demands on US firms in terms of storing data there, in terms of giving access to data there, in terms of working with local officials, in terms of giving over source code, in terms of working with the government to clamp down on free speech. So basically, our firms have to comply wherever they do business, and the United States to date has not been successful. And the firms, in my view, we can talk about this in question and answer, the firms, in my view, it's their decision as private firms to decide whether and when to do business. If the United States thinks that our firms shouldn't be doing business in China, then the United States should issue sanctions that prevents them from doing business. Otherwise, in my view, it's those firms' task to decide. And the truth is that the market in China is so enormous that no firm can afford to not participate there. Not only because the market there is big, but because China is developing homegrown competitors that are going to be global competitors as well. So the basic point is that the European bloc and the authoritarian bloc have been very successful at resisting the internet freedom idea. They've been very successful, as Tim and I and many other people predicted, at controlling their vision, imposing their vision within their territories. Okay. Now I'm going to turn to the domestic realm. So Tim and I wrote our book in 2006. That was the year Twitter was created. We didn't have Facebook was created 2 years earlier. I barely knew about it in 2006, even though it was started in Cambridge. We didn't say a word about social media in our book. We didn't say a word about cybersecurity in our book. We didn't say a word about surveillance in our book. These were factors that govern control of the internet that were just invisible to us at the time. And all of those things, cybersecurity and surveillance, especially challenge the paradigm that states can control activities within their borders. It turns out that cybersecurity is a very hard problem to deal with, and it's not a problem you can deal with simply by, it's not a problem you can deal with simply by asserting control in your borders. So, I'm sorry, I don't want to get to that yet. Let me see how I want to do this, sorry. Okay, so we didn't also talk about free speech at home. So now I'm going to move on and tell you the ways in which the internet freedom vision is actually doing harm at home. And the very premise that more speech is better is being called into question. So one is and I'm now moving to how freedom is working out at home. One is the idea of weaponized speech. This is something we see every day, we experience, some of us, and that we see articles about every day, about the ways in which speech is being used as a weapon to distort information, to attack speakers done by private entities and not by the state. The danger to speech here in this context is not from the state, and that's why our traditional First Amendment thinking doesn't work very well in analyzing this problem. The threat here comes from private speech that is extremely easy to produce and aggregate and send around very quickly, and that includes non-truthful speech or misleading speech or harmful speech, very harmful speech, that can either viciously attack certain targets and then thereby silence them in a private way that the government actually has a hard time regulating, that uses flooding tactics to distort speech by taking a piece of speech and just presenting a different reality. That become a very successful tool. This all comes up under the rubric of, this part in particular comes under the rubric of misinformation or fake news. It's also related to the extraordinary splintering and decentralization of media sources, the fact that we tend to get our media not from the New York Times and the Washington Post and 3 broadcast news shows in the evening, but from a whole plethora of sources, and that to the related idea that we can all opt into our daily me, as my colleague Cass Sunstein talks about it, and consume the news or be targeted with news that we're more likely to want to see. So on this problem of weaponized speech, I think this is a large problem. It's not a problem I'm an expert on, but it is one of the downsides. And it's also something that the government has a hard time regulating, because the First Amendment the First Amendment cannot regulate this type of harmful private speech that takes, at least not under traditional current doctrine, harmful speech that takes place in the private sector. The people who are the institutions making the decisions about speech are the private firms. And we're now in the middle of the private firms, Facebook and Twitter and the like, trying to figure out how they can regulate the speech to make it, for lack of a better phrase, and this is a weird phrase to say in the speech context, better, higher quality speech. To even say that is dangerous, because who decides that? That's the danger. I'm not yet talking about Russian operations or foreign operations. I'm just talking about domestic speech patterns. So this is all by way of saying that freedom of speech in the internet and social media era has yet to be theorized. Its value has yet to be theorized, I think it's fair to say. I'm actually somewhat agnostic on this. I think it's very hard yet to tell, because we don't understand the alternatives. I think that sometimes the idea of daily me's and retreating into our own worlds in which we don't see opposite views, Some of the social science, the emerging social science evidence on that suggests that that's overstated. And that with this plethora of media sources, we actually see a variety of views more often than we used to. But there's no doubt that there's something going on with free speech in the United States and that it's a problem. I'm more concerned, and I'm going to talk for the next few slides, about the relationship between, this is a non-obvious relationship, the relationship between our open and free society and cybersecurity. Because here I think we are at a serious asymmetric disadvantage vis-a-vis authoritarian states in protecting our digital networks. So these are 3 comments from Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, last month. Rob Joyce, who is the White House Cyber Czar, that was last November. And I think it's Robert Ashley. I keep forgetting his name. Robert Ashley is the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and this was in testimony yesterday. I could have given you 1,000 slides like this. The United States is literally under attack. It's under attack in a variety of contexts, and we're very much losing this battle. It's under attack in terms of our intellectual property being stolen and exfiltrated. It's under attack in terms of our public institutions having sensitive data stolen, whether it's the OPM hack or others, or the DNC hack, which I'll get to more in a second, the Office of Professional Management hack, in which the Chinese stole millions of records of very sensitive information about classified files of people who work in the government, and it did a lot of damage. The reason, in a nutshell, why cybersecurity is hard is because a great deal of our wealth and our security and our power is embedded in digital networks, literally embedded in digital networks. Those digital networks are connected often to the internet or through some means that could easily be connected to the internet. The number of actors who have access to that sensitive and important information and data that represents and embodies our power, it's not someone who walks to the door and gets in and steals something out of it. It's something that anyone in the world, in theory, has access to if those machines are directly or indirectly connected to the internet or a thumb drive or some other means of exfiltration. So the number of offensive actors is multiplied by the millions. Hundreds of millions possibly, so let's just say millions. Defense is hard in cybersecurity. Offense is easier because the nature of software and hardware vulnerabilities is such that they're impossible to eliminate, especially when, impossible is the wrong word, very, very hard to eliminate, especially when softwares interact in unpredictable ways. And that means that offense has an advantage because offense only has to find one way in and defense has to find every chink in the armor. For a variety of reasons, this means that we have had hundreds of billions by some measure of intellectual property stolen and all the other losses in the private and public sector that you read about every day in the news. So here is 3 slides about how our open society makes this problem worse. And I don't know what we can do about this. So you'll see at the end, I don't have great solutions to this. So the first point I want to make is, this is a point both about the combination of digital dependence, the fact that we as a society are deeply dependent on digital networks, from our phones to our homes to our cars. Digital dependence means that there's lots of attack space, that our adversaries have many, many places, an almost infinite number of attack sites. When that fact is combined with our free and open society, it makes for some difficult situations. One of the most notable elements of the last 3 or 4 years in which the government is constantly publicizing our digital losses is that we seem to do very little in response. This is a large puzzle. The United States seems hesitant to do anything in public. They talk a lot, but the sanctions, it's an indictment or it's some economic sanctions in the face of catastrophic losses. Even the sanctions in the face of the DNC hack seem minuscule to meet the task. There might be secret sanctions going on. It seems like they're not robust and they don't have much of a deterrent effect if they are. So one puzzle is, why is the greatest power in the world, and indeed the greatest offensive power in the world, so hesitant to fight back? And why is deterrence, why are we having such a hard time punishing our adversaries when they do this to us? There are many reasons for this. One of the reasons is that much of this stuff is not illegal under international law. That's another story which I won't have time to get into. But in fact, we, as Snowden shows, are doing things that are very related. And frankly, the United States has engaged in information operations for a very long time. All the things that are happening to us in one way or another, we have been doing to other countries for a long time. What was the Clinton Internet Freedom Initiative other than subsidizing U.S. and other entities to use tools in foreign networks to try to make changes to bring political change? That's what it was about, overtly. And that's for a variety of reasons I can't get into. We can talk about it in question and answer. That's not illegal under international law. So why are we hesitate? One reason we hesitate is we have an open society. And what that means is, this is a quote from Obama in his last press conference in 2016. And what he meant here is that we are unusually susceptible to information operations of the type that the Russians did against us. Compare what happened compare the propaganda that was used against us through social media, compare the doxing operations where information was stolen from the Democratic National Committee and then just published and then took on a kind of destructive life of its own. That can happen in a free society, and it's very hard for that to happen in a closed society. The Russians and the Chinese do a much, much better job of controlling speech and of controlling the circulation of speech and controlling access to that information. So we have an asymmetrical disadvantage in our open society in that we are much more subject to those types of foreign influence operations. Moreover, because we are so subject to those, one of the main reasons you hear this jargon being used in the newspapers, one of the main reasons we hesitate to attack in response is that we fear we lose in escalation, which means that every time, and this is what Clapper is talking about in this quote. This is from the Director of National Intelligence under Obama, Jim Clapper. Every time that the United States suffers these attacks, there's a large discussion in Washington about what are we going to do. There are a whole array of tools put on the table. And there's certain tools, you can't exactly use nuclear weapons or physical force against most of these attacks. It would be illegal under international law, and it would not be popular at home or abroad, probably. And it would lead to worse consequences in that respect. Cyber means, using cyber means can be more effective, although as I just described, we have fewer options in the use of cyber means abroad, in closed societies especially. And more importantly, here's what I mean by escalation. Every one of these situations, this has happened. This happened in OPM, it happened in the DNC hack, in the election hack. The United States hesitated because it feared retaliation to its retaliation. And every time they modeled it out, they thought, well, if we do this to them, they can come back and do a lot worse to us. We are basically an open target. And we're an open target in part, not only, but in part because we're a free society. And that means that the type of information operations, which can be much more sophisticated than the 2016 elections, we're much, much more vulnerable to that type of operation. Second, there are downsides to government transparency. This will seem perhaps surprising, but the United States is the most transparent government in the world when it comes to its intelligence operations, both voluntarily and involuntarily. We have many, many more leaks of intelligence information. And part of the reason we have many more leaks is because of the third point, we have extraordinary press freedoms, and there's a lot of talk about cracking down on the press and for the leaks of the recent years. It doesn't compare to any other country in the world in terms of our freedom of press. We are, for reasons I still puzzle over, but think I have an explanation for, the world's leaders in reporting our losses. The Chinese, the Europeans, they suffer cyber losses, especially in the public sector. They don't put them on the front page of the paper. It's a bit of a puzzle why. We do all the time. In part, it's because it leaks out. In part, it's because we live in a democracy and our government thinks they have to let people know who are adversely affected know about the adverse consequences. But in any event, we're constantly publicizing our losses at the same time that we're constantly publicizing our lack of reaction. It's funny, but it's devastating. We have extraordinarily open oversight, and believe it or not, we treat leakers better. So we have a permissive environment when it comes to the publication of intelligence information, and we publish a lot of information about losses. There's downsides to this. And I think this is another large, perhaps too subtle, but large explanation for our lack of deterrence policy. We have these independent pressures to disclose, and then once we disclose, there's pressure to attribute. And so the United States, as soon as something happens, who did it? And there's a big push to say who did it. And then the United States attributes, and oftentimes there's skepticism about the attribution, but even if there's not skepticism, practically nothing happens. So, and the asymmetrical disclosure of these cyber losses, followed by a lack of response, has a devastating impact on our deterrence policy, a devastating impact. And we're in this terrible cycle. And in part, the reason we're in this terrible cycle is because we talk about this stuff openly. We talk about it openly. We haven't been out to figure out a way to do anything about it. That sends signals that we are an open target, and that's exactly the way we're perceived by the rest of the world. The last point, I hesitate to say this in a law school, are the downsides of the rule of law. And I go a little bit beyond my talk here, so I'll just focus on the domestic rule of law. So on the one hand, the United States has the most legalistic military and intelligence bureaucracy in the world by a large margin. We take law, this may be a surprise to you, especially when it comes to the initiation of use of force and compliance with the UN Charter. But outside that context where I actually don't think we take legal compliance very seriously, we take legal compliance very seriously. We also have a very robust domestic legal protections, the First and Fourth Amendment, and a variety of statutory protections that keeps the United States from basically being in the network. And we take international law seriously in cyber operations. There are operations that we don't do because we worry about collateral consequences and proportionality, and that we worry about sovereignty concerns, especially neutrals. And so our military and intelligence takes these rules very seriously. The rest of the world doesn't. And this has a really asymmetrical impact on our security. And really the main point I want to focus on, because it's the domestic point, is the first point. The network, the digital network, is in private hands. It's owned by private companies. The United States uses the network for 90-some-odd% of its traffic, but it's owned by private companies. It's the only channel of attack, airspace, sea, and land. It's the only, being the others, the only channel of attack where the United States government does not have control. It does not have control of the weapons coming into the border and being used against us. And there are significant legal restrictions preventing the United States from having access and control. And there are a lot of good reasons for this, and reasons that we cherish and that are very important, but they also put us at a disadvantage. By contrast, authoritarian states don't have these problems. China has very serious cybersecurity concerns also, because it too, like the United States and unlike, say, North Korea, is deeply digitally dependent. And they have very serious cybersecurity problems. They're doing things about those cybersecurity problems that we could never do, starting with the Great Wall of China, which can be used to keep out stuff at a crude level, cybersecurity threats at a crude level, to eliminating, they're in the process of having a very significant digital registration process to eliminate anonymity, which makes cybersecurity easier to do, to insisting on backdoor access to encrypted communications, to insisting on backdoor access to encrypted data or to not being encrypted, to being fully present in the network and to be able to respond to malicious activity very quickly. So there's a serious asymmetry, because the rule of law is one side of our openness at home, our freedoms at home. But it makes cybersecurity that much harder, and it creates an asymmetrical weakness with our adversaries. Okay, this is the story that I think wraps it all up. So when Hillary Clinton gave her speech in 2010, she had Russia in mind. She had the Russians in mind, in part. And she had the idea of using these digital tools to help bring freedom, to help break down the authoritarian state in Russia. And in the legislative elections of 2011, after those legislative elections, there were protests in Russia, very serious protests. Some people thought Putin was endangered. He, at the time, blamed Hillary Clinton for that. He believed, whether correctly or not, that this was all part of the U.S. freedom operation to bring digital tools abroad, to help protesters coordinate, to help them maintain anonymity, to help them bring down the regime, or at least affect the regime. That's the way he viewed it. That operation in 2011, if it was one, failed. But it might have been what gave him the idea. There are a lot of episodes like this in the 2000s. But his similar operation in the United States wildly succeeded. And it wildly succeeded in 2016 with a very crude and simple, the crudest and simplest propaganda effort, but really it was the doxing operation, the stealing of the DNC materials and the publication of those and the churning that took place that we're still living with the consequences of. So the basic story is we wanted to bring internet freedom abroad. We failed, but our adversaries, especially our authoritarian adversaries, are using our freedom against us to do very significant harm to us. That, in a nutshell, sums up what I've been trying to say. Okay, it's at this point that I'm supposed to tell you how we're going to fix this, but I'm running out of time, and I don't have any answers. I and a lot of other people, including I'm sure people in this room, have thought about this a lot. There's no single answer. There are a lot of answers, and none of them are happy ones. Assuming, and then probably aren't going to be successful. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And my own view, my large picture view, is that the internet is actually, as it's developing, a technology that on a variety of fronts, even though we have this short-term surge in our companies and in our political and diplomatic power, I think in the medium term it's going to do us enormous, enormous damage. These are three things I think will happen. I think that the internet freedom agenda is dead because Donald Trump is president and he has no interest in pushing human rights abroad, but I don't think it will be revived under the next administration. It was because I think the hypocrisy of it and its lack of efficaciousness, it might continue, but it's going to be rethought. I think that, and I've written a lot about this, I won't be able to say much about it here, the United States, I feel very strongly about this. What we're complaining about now and what we're devastated about now with what happened to us last year, the United States is widely perceived, not without a large element of truth, to do exactly those things abroad. Now, it looks different because we're the good guys fighting for democracy abroad. But for the Chinese and the Russians, we're meddling in their digital networks to affect their sovereignty and the nature of their government. And I don't believe that we're going to be able to get relief from the very destructive operations that are being taken against us. And I'm not suggesting this is an easy solution, but I don't think we have any chance of getting relief unless we're willing to give some stuff up. And no one is talking about giving stuff up. And finally, we're in the middle, it's starting now. I've got stacks of things, I can't keep up with all the things being written about this. We're in the middle of rethinking freedom of speech at home. And what that means, whether the First Amendment needs to change, how internet service providers and social media should act to shape speech, what should we do both to have the proper speech at home and to minimize foreign infiltration in speech. We're going to have, for your legal careers, this is going to be the big issue in speech. And I'm going to stop there, and I've got 9 minutes to take questions if you like. Yes, sir.
What would qualify as an armed attack under international law? That's a cyber engagement. What level would it go to? And what do you think the U.S., in an ideal world, if they could just change the international law today, what should it look like for the U.S.'s benefit?
That's a big question. And there's a lot of debate about this. Look, I just tell you, I don't have any views beyond the conventional wisdom on. I'll say two things. I don't have any profound views beyond the conventional wisdom. The challenge here is to take the concepts of the UN Charter, use of force and armed attack, these are kinetic terms, and to translate them into a digital world. And the basic answer is that if something happens digitally that causes the same harm or analogous harm to something that happens kinetically, then it has the same legal consequences. As a first cut, I think that's, as an analogy, probably the place to start. I don't think it's going to end there, but I don't know the answer to that. But let me just say that that is not where the action is. And so much scholarship and focus on attacks. All of the action, almost all of the damage is below the threshold of armed attacks and uses of force. The DNC hack, the OPM operation. There are lots of enormously damaging things that our adversaries can do to us by stealing information and publicizing, by stealing information and using it to build products abroad and the like that don't implicate the charter. And that's where the action is, and that's where most of the harm is. Yes.
On the domestic side, there's been a lot of discussion of net neutrality, and I thought it was interesting. Do you think that that is in the same category of these concerns, or?
You know, I'm no expert on net neutrality. I don't think those, I think my own view, and I'm not an expert on this, is that the net neutrality debate has become a theological debate about something else. And I don't think there's a lot of empirical evidence yet about what will actually happen if there's pricing differentials for the delivery of content. I don't, but the short answer is I don't see how it directly intersects with this. Yes.
Hi, so you mentioned Europe a little bit in the beginning of your speech, but then kind of deviated
Right.
from it a bit. And I was wondering if you could respond to what Europe is doing. They're facing similar threats. Now, I've heard one suggestion is that they have different, for example, campaign laws and voting laws. So, for example, campaigns are much shorter, so there's therefore less opportunity to do damage. Do you think that Europe is building its own roadmap? And if so, is it one that we might look to?
So again, I don't know about that much either. I don't think, so the problem, roadmap for what? I mean, they're very concerned about data privacy. And there's a new regulation, European-wide regulation that's about to come into force in a couple of months that is the most demanding and restrictive privacy regulation there is. On that issue, they're making their will felt, and successfully so. And they just have a different view about privacy than we do, and they're imposing that will on our companies, and our companies are moving there, storing data there, both for political and logistical reasons, and we're basically losing that. If you think it's losing, I mean losing against the baseline of our conception of privacy, but some people think they have a better conception of privacy. I don't know what they're doing on elections. I frankly have not seen great proposals anywhere for how to deal with the types of electoral interference that the Russians carried out. Doxing operations, as President Obama described that was an unsophisticated attack that revealed information that was disclosed and that had these devastating impacts. If you just imagine we're not going to be able to stop that from happening. People worry about protecting the voter counts and the things like that, and we're taking steps, and again, I'm not an expert on this, we're taking steps to deal with those problems. I'm a little skeptical about that as well. But on the types of propaganda, Facebooks and Twitters of the world, they're taking steps to eliminate anonymity, to try to eliminate bots, to generate to certain bots from certain entities. But again, my own view is that the propaganda stuff was less consequential than the doxing operation. And when it comes to stealing information strategically and releasing it, I don't see how any of these countries can do anything about that. And so I don't see that type of electoral interference being changed at all. And no, I haven't seen Europe doing anything about that. But the truth is I'm no expert on what the Europeans are doing on that. Yes, in the back. Yes, sir. No, you, with the beard, yeah.
So one of the few constants of the internet since its inception has been individuals breaking things and just kind of upsetting the status quo. Do you see any space for the private actors involved, the technology companies, those scary big five, to come in and sort of not solve this, but lessen the impact, and how?
Again, that's a large question, and I'll give you a very large abstract answer. I don't. Look at the kind of things that a lot of economists and policymakers think need to be done to improve basic cybersecurity, which means making software better, which means making disclosures faster, which means basically forcing companies to take the products they deliver to us to be more secure, involves regulation. It involves regulation, it involves the imposition of standards, it involves liability. All of those things are entirely anathema to those companies, which they see as killing innovation. And so far, those companies have won. And by the way, this problem is just about to get a whole lot harder and worse because of the Internet of Things, and we're not doing a darn thing to regulate cybersecurity there. So I don't think the companies on their own, absent changes in liability and regulation and taxes and the like, absent government intervention, they have no incentive, frankly. Microsoft, I shouldn't say they have no incentive. They have a reputational concern, and so Google's a pretty secure product. Microsoft has done a lot to improve its software. They've done this through purely internal market reasons because they've perceived that it was important their products have better security. But they only have an incentive to do that up to the point where it makes them the next dollar, and then they don't have that incentive anymore. And it really requires government regulation. I'm not saying that's a good idea because, frankly, the government often gets it wrong. And it's very hard to know, and I'm not seeing any great analysis of how we measure the costs on innovation and the like. I just don't know. The companies scream and yell saying you're going to kill our innovation advantage. And one of the reasons that we've been such leaders in all these areas is because we have less regulation. I just don't know how to assess that. I haven't studied it enough yet, but that's the argument.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.